Maggie Carter had opened that bank account more times than she could count. Mortgage payments, grocery runs, insurance drafts, the electric bill that always seemed to be higher than it should have been. Nothing exciting. Just the quiet numbers that kept a 27-year marriage standing. But on that Tuesday morning, one transfer stopped her cold. $5,000. Taken from their joint savings. Sent to a woman named Vanessa Lane. For a moment, Maggie just stared at the name. She tried to do what faithful wives often do at first. She tried to build one last, innocent explanation for the man she had trusted most of her adult life. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it was business. Maybe Richard had a reason. Then she saw the memo line. 4 words. For our new place. That was the moment Maggie understood. Richard had not just been having an affair. He had been building another life with her money. And the worst part was not that he thought he could do it. The worst part was that he thought she would never look closely enough to notice. Stay with this story, and if you believe evidence can speak louder than excuses, subscribe for more stories about betrayal, divorce, custody battles, and the quiet moments when people finally take their power back. Maggie Carter was 52 years old, and she was the kind of woman people usually underestimated. Not because she was weak, because she was steady. She was not loud when she entered a room. She did not dress to be watched. She did not need every conversation to turn toward her. At the small dental clinic where she worked as an office manager, Maggie was the person everyone depended on, without always saying so. She knew which patient files were missing signatures. She knew when the next shipment of gloves had to be ordered. She knew which insurance claim would get rejected if one box was checked wrong. She knew who was late, who had paid, and which bill absolutely had to be handled before Friday. That was Maggie's talent. She kept things from falling apart. And she did the same thing at home. She knew when the mortgage cleared. She knew which card had the lower interest rate. She knew when their son Ethan needed new cleats, when the car insurance renewed, and when the refrigerator started making that tired little hum that meant another repair was coming. Richard used to tease her about it. He would say she loved spreadsheets more than she loved him. Maggie would give him that tired wife look and say those spreadsheets were the only reason he still had a house to complain in. Back then, it sounded like marriage. Not a perfect marriage. Not the polished kind people try to sell in Christmas photos and anniversary posts. A real one. Some weeks were warm. Some weeks were tense. Some nights ended with leftovers, school emails, a load of laundry left in the dryer, and 2 tired people sitting on opposite ends of the couch, too worn out to fight, and too used to each other to stay angry for long. Maggie and Richard had been married for 27 years. Their house in the suburbs was not large, but it had a memory in almost every corner. Ethan had taken his first steps by the living room window. Richard's father had slept in the guest room during the last months of his illness. Maggie had painted the kitchen cabinets herself one summer because hiring someone felt wasteful, and she had told herself the sore shoulders were worth it. That was how she had built her life. One careful decision at a time. One saved dollar. One postponed vacation. One repair done before it became an emergency. In Maggie's eyes, Richard had always been a man solid enough to trust. He went to work. He kept the yard decent. He waved at neighbors. He remembered her mother's birthday. He talked about retirement like it was still something they were walking toward together. Maybe somewhere warmer. Maybe closer to the coast. Maybe a smaller house one day, with less grass to cut and fewer things waiting to break. Maggie believed him, not because she was foolish, because she had spent almost 3 decades beside him. She had stood with Richard when he lost his job once and tried to pretend he was not scared. She had helped pay down credit card debt he hated even looking at. She had taken time off work when his father got worse. She had passed up things she wanted because the family needed something else more. That kind of sacrifice changes a person. It makes you believe the life you built must mean something to the person standing inside it with you. Maggie was not naive. She knew marriage could get tired. She knew people could disappoint each other. She knew love did not always feel soft. But she believed years left roots, and for a long time, those roots looked strong. Then Vanessa Lane came back into Richard's life. At first, the name arrived quietly, almost politely. Richard mentioned her one evening over dinner, while Maggie was cutting chicken into smaller pieces, because Ethan had come home from practice starving and impatient. Vanessa was an old colleague, he said. She had come back as a consultant on a company project. She was going through a rough divorce. She did not have much support. Maggie nodded, because it sounded harmless enough. People went through hard seasons. People needed help. Maggie had lived long enough to know that. And Maggie was not a cruel woman. But Vanessa's name did not leave after that. It began showing up in Richard's stories. A meeting Vanessa had saved. A client Vanessa understood better than anyone else. A joke Vanessa had made during a long call. A problem Vanessa was having with her lawyer. A landlord giving Vanessa trouble. A school issue with Vanessa's daughter. Small things. Always small things. Never enough on their own to point at and say, there, that is the betrayal. That was what made Maggie feel ridiculous for noticing. Richard began coming home later. Not every night. Not enough to create one clean argument. Just often enough for Maggie to feel the change before she could prove it. His phone started landing face down on the kitchen counter. His laptop password changed, and when Maggie asked about it, he said the company had tightened security. He bought 2 new dress shirts and said they were for client meetings. He started going back to the gym, and when Maggie asked what had brought that on, he smiled and said there was nothing suspicious about a man trying not to fall apart before 60. The calls bothered her most. He took them in the garage, or outside near the driveway. Sometimes Maggie would walk into a room and hear his voice drop into that lower, careful tone people use when they do not want their words carried too far. When she asked who it was, Richard always answered. That was the clever part. He did not act guilty in any obvious way. He simply looked tired, disappointed, like the question itself had wounded him. Vanessa, he would say. Just Vanessa. She's trying to get back on her feet. That became his line, his little shield. Anytime Maggie looked uncomfortable, Richard turned the conversation around and handed the discomfort back to her. You're making this ugly. You've been bitter lately. A secure wife wouldn't care about a work dinner. You're acting like I'm on trial in my own house. He never had to yell. That was why it worked. He stayed calm, reasonable, almost sad. He spoke as if he were the patient husband trying to survive a suspicious wife. By the end of those conversations, Maggie often found herself apologizing for questions that had made perfect sense when she first asked them. That is the quiet genius of gaslighting. It does not always shout that the sky is green. Sometimes it only asks why you are so obsessed with the color. After a while, Maggie started wondering if age had made her smaller inside. Maybe she was afraid of being replaced. Maybe she was holding too tightly. Maybe, after 27 years, she had forgotten how modern adults were supposed to handle old colleagues, old friendships, and women in crisis. Richard always sounded so certain, and Maggie was tired. Tired of feeling like the suspicious wife. Tired of hearing her own questions turned into personality flaws. Tired of standing in her own kitchen, feeling like she had to defend the right to notice what was happening in front of her. So she tried to believe him. She really did. Until one Tuesday morning, when the bank sent an alert Richard had forgotten to turn off. Maggie was sitting at the kitchen table with a half-empty cup of coffee and the electric bill open on her laptop. The washing machine was running in the laundry room. Ethan had already left for school. The house had that plain, ordinary quiet that makes betrayal feel even colder when it walks in. The alert said a large transfer had been made from their joint savings account. At first, Maggie thought it had to be something boring. Maybe insurance. Maybe a repair deposit. Maybe Richard had moved money and forgotten to mention it. Then the transaction loaded. $5,000. Transferred to Vanessa Lane. Maggie looked at the screen and waited for her mind to catch up. Her first feeling was not rage. It was confusion. The mind does that sometimes. It tries to protect you for one last second. It gives the person you love one more chance to be innocent before the truth sits down across from you and refuses to leave. Then Maggie saw the memo line. For our new place. 4 words. No perfume on a collar. No lipstick on a shirt. No hotel receipt tucked in a pocket. Just 4 words under a bank transfer. Neat and casual. Like a receipt for the life Richard had been building outside their marriage. Maggie did not scream. She did not throw the laptop. She did not call Vanessa and demand an explanation from a woman who already knew too much. She sat there until her coffee went cold, listening to the washing machine finish its cycle, while 27 years quietly rearranged themselves in her mind. When Richard came home that evening, Maggie waited until Ethan was upstairs. Then she asked him, very softly, "Did you send Vanessa money?" Richard paused. Only half a second. But after 27 years, Maggie knew the difference between thinking and calculating. Then he said Vanessa needed a loan. Her divorce was ugly. Her landlord was pressuring her. He had not told Maggie because he knew she would turn it into something it was not. Maggie asked about the memo line. Richard looked at her as if she had placed something shameful on the table. He said Vanessa must have typed it wrong. He said people wrote careless things when they were under stress. He said Maggie was reading malice into a banking note because she had already decided to be hurt. Then his voice changed. It got quieter, sharper. Are you really going to destroy 27 years over a banking note? There it was. Not an answer. A trap. If Maggie cried, he would call her unstable. If she yelled, he would call her bitter. If she demanded the whole truth, he would warn Vanessa, clean up the records, and turn the evening into another lecture about trust. So Maggie did something Richard did not expect. She nodded. She said she needed time. And that night, after he went to bed, she took screenshots. She downloaded the statement. She printed the transfer confirmation. She placed everything inside a blue folder and slid it into the bottom drawer of her desk. That night, Maggie Carter stopped trying to win an argument with a man who had already chosen his lie. She started preparing for the truth. The next morning, Maggie did not call Vanessa. She did not drive to Richard's office. She did not sit in a parking lot waiting for a woman she had never met. She did not search through Richard's phone while he slept. She understood something many people only learn after the damage gets worse. A person willing to hide money is usually willing to hide the rest. So Maggie did the one thing Richard would never have expected from the woman he kept calling emotional. She made an appointment with a divorce attorney. Elaine Porter worked out of a small office above the title company on the west side of town. There was no marble lobby, no dramatic wall of awards, no soft music pretending bad news could be made gentle. Just a neat desk, a tired printer, and the face of a woman who had spent 20 years watching people mistake heartbreak for evidence. Maggie placed the bank transfer in front of her. $5,000. Vanessa Lane. For our new place. Elaine read it once. Then she read it again. She did not gasp. She did not call Richard a monster. She did not promise Maggie that court would ruin him, because good attorneys do not sell revenge to wounded people. That was why Maggie trusted her. Elaine looked up and said, "According to your attorney, in this state, the money trail may matter. But we need records, not feelings." That sentence settled into Maggie like a hand on her shoulder. Records, not feelings. Because feelings were what Richard could twist. Feelings were what he could call jealousy. Feelings were what he could rename as bitterness, insecurity, age, control, or whatever else made him sound innocent. Records were harder to insult. So Maggie went home and started gathering everything she could legally access. Not secrets. Not stolen passwords. Not anything she had to sneak into. Just the records of a marriage she had spent 27 years helping to hold together. Bank statements from their joint accounts, credit card bills, mortgage records, tax returns, retirement summaries, shared phone bills, insurance payments, utility records, receipts from the family email, anything tied to their household, their money, and the life Richard had been pretending was still shared. Maggie did not hack anything. She did not break into anything. She did not need to. Richard had made the mistake a lot of careless men make when they live with a careful woman for too long. He had confused her patience with blindness. At first, most of the numbers looked ordinary. Groceries, gas, Ethan's school fees, the mortgage, a dental bill from March, a pharmacy charge, a home repair deposit. All the plain little transactions that keep a family moving forward without ever becoming a story. Then Elaine's assistant found the rhythm underneath it. $300 here, $800 there. A cash withdrawal on a Thursday afternoon. A furniture store charge Richard had explained as office equipment. A recurring payment to an apartment complex Maggie had never heard of. A monthly storage unit fee. Another payment marked only as help. None of it was large enough to start a fight by itself. That was what made it so ugly. Richard had not pulled $50,000 out of the account in one obvious move. He had drained the marriage slowly, quietly, a little at a time. Just enough to keep Maggie from seeing the shape of it while she was busy paying the bills, packing lunches, checking Ethan's calendar, and making sure the roof over everyone's head stayed in place. Over 14 months, it added up to almost $38,000. $38,000. Maggie looked at that number for a long time. The affair had hurt her heart. But the money insulted her whole life, because that was not just money. That was the emergency fund she had protected like it was oxygen. That was the roof repair they kept postponing. That was Ethan's tutoring. That was a retirement cushion Richard used to praise her for building. That was 27 years of coupons, overtime, secondhand furniture, delayed vacations, and saying, maybe next year, while Richard was quietly funding another woman's next month. When Elaine showed Maggie the total, Maggie did not break down. She did not cover her face. She did not ask why he did not love her anymore. She only looked at the papers and asked, how long has he been planning this? Elaine did not answer right away. And somehow, that silence was worse than a number. Around that same time, Richard started talking about Ethan. At first, he sounded almost noble about it. He said he did not want their son dragged into adult problems. Ethan was 16, Richard said. Old enough to understand that marriages got complicated. Old enough not to be used as leverage. Maggie almost wanted to believe that part of him. Almost. Then Richard's attorney received the first estimate for child support, school expenses, and temporary household costs. And suddenly, Richard wanted 50-50 custody. Not slowly. Not after a long conversation about Ethan's needs. Not after years of being the parent who showed up without being reminded. Overnight. He wanted alternating weeks. He wanted equal say in every school decision. He wanted to be seen as the same kind of parent Maggie had been, even though he had spent the last year missing the small things that actually make a parent equal. Maggie saw it for what it was. It was not a father discovering devotion. It was a man discovering math. Still, Maggie did not speak badly about Richard to Ethan. She did not sit her son down and empty the whole marriage onto his lap. She did not ask him to choose sides. She did not turn him into a witness before he was ready to understand what he had witnessed. She did something quieter. She wrote down the truth. The soccer game Richard missed because of a client dinner. The parent meeting he forgot. The dentist appointment Maggie handled alone. The SAT practice day Richard promised to drive Ethan to, then canceled 30 minutes before. The nights Ethan ate dinner with one parent while the other parent sent vague messages about being tied up. Maggie recorded dates, times, texts, calendar entries, not because she wanted to punish Richard, because if he was going to turn fatherhood into a financial strategy, she wanted the court to understand the difference between asking for time and actually showing up. Then came the detail that made Maggie's stomach turn cold in a new way. Elaine called one afternoon and asked about a payment Maggie had not marked. It was smaller than the others, only $187. The memo read, School Supply Help L. L. She did not know any L. Elaine's office found out soon enough. Vanessa had an 8-year-old daughter named Lily, and Richard had been sending money connected to that child for months. Sometimes school supplies, sometimes medical copays, sometimes clothing, sometimes small weekend expenses that looked harmless until someone placed them all in a row and asked why a married man was quietly paying them from family money. Maggie sat very still while Elaine explained it. There was no proof yet of what Richard believed. Not enough to say it out loud as fact, but there was enough to ask questions. Was Richard supporting Vanessa's daughter? Did he believe Lily was his child? Had Maggie's marital money been used not only for an affair, but for a second family she had never agreed to support? Elaine was careful. She always was. She told Maggie that if Richard had used marital funds to support another household, the court needed to know. If he planned to claim some kind of responsibility for Lily, the truth had to be established properly. But it had to go through legal channels. Discovery. Requests. Documents. Not screaming across a kitchen table. Not accusations thrown in the heat of pain. Maggie listened. By then, she understood what this had become. During the day, she was still Richard Carter's wife. She made dinner. She asked Ethan about school. She folded towels. She passed Richard the salt while he lied about quarterly reports and late client calls. She watched him move through the house like a man who still believed every room belonged to him. At night, she became someone else. A woman sitting alone in a quiet house with a blue folder open in front of her. A woman marking every line of her own marriage in red ink. A woman learning that betrayal is not always one terrible act. Sometimes it is a system, a habit, a second set of books, a secret life paid for with the money of the person still washing your shirts. But Maggie still did not know the most humiliating part. Richard had not only been hiding money, he had been using it to build a new home before his old one even knew it had been abandoned. The discovery process did not feel dramatic. That was the strange thing. There was no thunder, no sudden confession, no envelope slid across a table with every answer inside. There were only documents, pages and pages of them. And when the truth finally arrived, it came in the same dull language Richard had been hiding behind for months. Lease agreement, security deposit, recurring rent payment, furniture delivery, storage unit invoice, apartment access fee. Richard had signed paperwork connected to the apartment Vanessa was living in. His name was not printed as the tenant in the obvious place, but his money was everywhere. The deposit had come from the joint savings account. The first month's rent had been covered through a transfer Maggie had once believed was a business expense. A sofa, a bed frame, kitchen chairs, and a small dining table had been charged to a credit card Maggie helped pay every month. The apartment was not a suspicion anymore. It had an address. It had invoices. It had a delivery schedule. It had Maggie's money in the walls. Then Elaine found the email Richard had written to Vanessa. I need more time before Maggie starts asking questions. Once Ethan is settled, we can talk about moving things forward. Our place has to feel stable before anything changes. Our place. There it was again. Not a mistake in a memo line. not a careless phrase from a stressed woman. A pattern, a plan, a life. Those were the words of a man who had already left emotionally, but still wanted his wife paying the bills until his exit became comfortable. After that, Maggie began living two lives more completely than ever. In one life, Richard came home and said work had been exhausting. Maggie nodded. She asked whether he wanted chicken or soup. She reminded Ethan to finish his homework. She folded Richard's shirts and placed them on the bed, knowing one of them had probably been worn inside Vanessa's apartment. In the other life, Maggie sat beside Elaine and reviewed records that made her marriage look less like a partnership and more like a slow withdrawal. She did not know which part was harder, the pretending or the knowing. Then the question about Lily moved from quiet suspicion into open air. Richard's attorney tried to explain some of the payments as support for a child he believed he had a moral obligation toward. That phrase sounded careful. Too careful. Elaine pushed. If Richard believed he had a parental obligation to Vanessa's daughter, then the court needed clarity. Especially if he was using that belief to explain missing marital funds, financial pressure, or his sudden claim that Maggie did not understand his responsibilities. Richard agreed to a DNA test, not because he was humble, because he thought it would make him look honorable. He wanted the role of the misunderstood man, the one who had been caring for a child no one else would care for. The decent man caught between an angry wife and a complicated past. The man who had made mistakes, yes, but only because his heart was too responsible. For a few days, Maggie almost hated him for that more than the affair. He had taken her money, her trust, her marriage, and somehow he still wanted the noble part in the story. Then the results came back. Richard was not Lily's father. That was the one moment Maggie felt no satisfaction. Lily was 8 years old. She had done nothing wrong. She was a child, pulled into a mess made by adults who should have known better. Maggie refused to turn that little girl into a punchline for karma. Vanessa had lied. Richard had believed her. Or maybe he had simply wanted to believe her, because that lie made his betrayal sound less selfish. It gave him a reason that sounded almost honorable. He was not just cheating. He was helping. He was not stealing from his marriage. He was being responsible. That is the kind of lie people reach for when they need their sin to look like sacrifice. Richard found out Maggie had an attorney 2 nights later. He came into the kitchen with the expression of a man who had been embarrassed before he had been wounded. His voice was low, controlled. Angry in the way men get when they realize the person they underestimated has been learning quietly. "How long have you been digging through my life?" he asked. Maggie was standing near the sink. She dried her hands on a towel, slowly, carefully. Then she opened the blue folder and placed one page on the table. The $5,000 transfer. Vanessa Lane, for our new place. Richard looked at the paper like it had betrayed him. Maggie did not raise her voice. "You told me I was destroying 27 years over a banking note," she said. "No, Richard. You destroyed it. I just read the memo." For a second, he had nothing. No lecture, no sad look, no clever turn of phrase. Just silence. Then he reached for the tools he knew. He called her cold. He called her calculated. He said she had been waiting for a reason to punish him. He said living with her had felt like being audited for years. He said no man could breathe in a house where every dollar had to explain itself. Maggie let him talk. She had spent too many years answering accusations that were only designed to pull the spotlight away from the truth. When he finished, she said one thing. "Everything goes through my attorney now." Richard stared at her as if he was seeing her for the first time. Maybe he was. For 27 years, he had treated Maggie's carefulness like a flaw. He was about to learn it was the reason she survived him. Richard thought the worst part was that Maggie knew. He had not yet understood that the court was going to know too. By the time the divorce hearing began, Richard had already decided which version of himself he wanted the room to see. He came in dressed like the reasonable one. Dark suit, clean shave, quiet voice, tired eyes that looked almost rehearsed. That had always been one of Richard's gifts. He knew how to look like the man who had been pushed too far, even when he was the one who had done the pushing. His attorney described the marriage as strained, complicated, emotionally distant. He said Richard had made mistakes, but not cruel ones. He said Vanessa was a vulnerable woman, going through a painful divorce. He said Richard had tried to help someone who had no one else. Then he turned toward Maggie without really turning toward her. He said Maggie had become suspicious, rigid, financially controlling. Maggie sat beside Elaine and listened. There was a time when those words would have cut her open. There was a time when she would have wanted to explain herself, to prove she was not cold, not bitter, not small. Not the kind of wife who turned every question into a courtroom. But by then, those words only sounded familiar. A weak story will always try to make the truth look unreasonable. Elaine did not perform. She did not slam her hand on the table. She did not raise her voice. She did not make some dramatic speech about betrayal, marriage, or broken vows. She did something much worse for Richard. She stayed calm. Then she walked the court through the records, one page at a time. The $5,000 transfer, the memo line, for our new place. The smaller payment spread across 14 months. The apartment connected to Vanessa. The security deposit. The furniture charges. The storage unit. The email where Richard called the apartment our place. The message where he said he needed more time before Maggie started asking questions. The school supply payment marked with Lily's initial. The DNA result showing Richard was not Lily's father. No shouting. No guessing. No revenge, dressed up as justice. Just paper. Clean, dated, boring paper. And somehow, that made it feel worse. Because Richard could argue with Maggie's tears. He could talk around her anger. He could rename her pain as insecurity and call her questions controlling. But he could not flirt his way around a bank statement. Then Elaine moved to Ethan. That was when Richard shifted in his chair. He had asked for 50-50 custody. On paper, it sounded respectable. A father wanting equal time with his son. A man refusing to be pushed out of his child's life. A parent demanding fairness. But context has a way of stripping pretty words down to their bones. Elaine showed the calendar Maggie had kept. Not feelings. Dates. The school meeting Maggie attended alone. The dental appointment Richard missed. The soccer game he skipped for a dinner he had called work. The SAT practice day he promised to drive Ethan to, then canceled 30 minutes before. The nights Ethan texted his father and received answers hours later. Short answers. Distracted answers. The kind that made a child stop asking after a while. Richard's attorney said no parent was perfect. And he was right. No parent is... Maggie was not perfect either. She had been tired. She had snapped some nights. She had worried too much about money. She had checked the calendar like a woman trying to keep the whole house from sliding off its foundation. But Elaine was not arguing perfection. She was arguing pattern. Richard had not been asking for more time with Ethan before support numbers were placed in front of him. He had asked after, "There is a difference between wanting your child and wanting a lower payment." The judge saw it. Nobody stood up and declared Richard a terrible father. Real life is rarely that clean. He had loved Ethan in his own uneven way. He had moments of kindness. He had memories. He had history. But the court questioned whether his sudden demand for equal time was built around Ethan's stability or Richard's expenses. That question alone changed the air in the room. Richard tried to explain the money next. He said Vanessa had needed help. He said Lily had needed stability. He said he had been under emotional pressure. He said Maggie had never understood how hard it was to carry responsibility for everyone. That was almost impressive, in a bitter sort of way. Even there, sitting in court, with his own record spread out in front of him, Richard still wanted to be seen as the burdened man, the generous man, the man whose lies were just misunderstood acts of care. Elaine let him say all of it. Then she asked one simple question. If it was only help, why did the memo line say, "For our new place"? Richard went quiet. Not for long, but long enough. There are silences that explain more than a confession. That was one of them. According to Elaine, in their state, the court could consider how marital funds had been used and whether one spouse had hidden spending that harmed the marital estate. She did not promise punishment for heartbreak. She did not ask the judge to care about the affair the way Maggie's heart cared about it. She kept it plain. Richard had used shared money for a private relationship. Richard had failed to disclose it. Richard had tried to explain it only after Maggie found the records. That was enough. Because court is not built for broken hearts. It is built for documents, obligations, patterns, consequences. And the records were ugly. Maggie was allowed to remain in the family home until Ethan finished school. Richard was ordered to account for the marital funds used on Vanessa's apartment and the expenses tied to it. Child support was calculated from his real income, not the softened version he had tried to present. His custody request was narrowed to a schedule that reflected Ethan's actual stability, not Richard's financial convenience. Attorney fees were considered because Richard had forced Maggie to chase records he should have disclosed from the start. The retirement accounts were divided, with Maggie's long contribution to the household taken seriously. It was not revenge. Not really. It was math with a memory. That was what Richard had never understood. Numbers, remember. Bank accounts, remember. Calendars, remember. Receipts, remember. And sometimes, after years of being called too careful, too rigid, too suspicious, those quiet little records become the only witnesses who never change their story. Vanessa left the apartment 3 weeks later. There was no grand scene, no screaming in the parking lot, no dramatic confrontation outside the courthouse. No moment where she fell to her knees and apologized for stepping into another woman's marriage. She simply left. Once the money was being watched, the romance lost some of its glow. That was the part Richard seemed least prepared for. Some love stories only look deep when someone else is paying the rent. He lost the secret apartment. He lost the version of himself that looked generous. He lost the ability to call Maggie paranoid. And he lost something quieter, too. He lost the way Ethan used to look at him. Ethan did not hate his father. That would have been easier in some ways. Hate has heat. Hate gives people somewhere to put the pain. What Ethan felt was colder than that. Disappointment. The quiet kind. The kind that sits in a room and does not need to announce itself. He was old enough to understand that adults can break more than promises. They can break trust. They can break safety. They can make a child question which parts of home had been real and which parts had only been well managed. Maggie never celebrated that. She did not want Ethan wounded just so Richard could be punished. That was not victory. That was fallout. Near the end of the hearing, Richard tried one last time to make himself sound misunderstood. He said he had only been trying to help. The judge looked down at the file, then back at him. "You were not punished for helping someone," the judge said. "You were held responsible for hiding marital money and misleading this court." Maggie did not smile. She did not feel triumphant in the way people expect. There was no rush of joy, no sweet taste of revenge, no sudden healing. She just breathed. For months, Richard had called her bitter, suspicious, controlling, cold. Now a stranger in a courtroom had read the same papers and called it what it was. Not insecurity, not jealousy, evidence. And for the first time in a long time, Maggie did not need to explain why the truth hurt. The record had done it for her. 6 months later. Maggie Carter lived in a townhouse, smaller than the home she had fought so hard to keep for Ethan. It did not have the big backyard. It did not have the wide kitchen island Richard used to lean against while pretending nothing was wrong. It did not have the guest room where his father had stayed. It did not have the front porch Maggie had painted twice because she wanted the house to look cared for, even when she was too tired to care for herself. But everything inside that townhouse was hers. The curtains were hers. The small oak table was hers. The chip blue mug beside the coffee maker was hers. Even the silence was hers. And that mattered more than she expected. For years, Maggie had thought peace would feel like winning something big. A larger settlement. A public apology. Richard standing in front of everyone, finally admitting what he had done. But peace was much quieter than that. Peace was sleeping through the night without listening for his car in the driveway. Peace was opening a bank statement without feeling her stomach tighten. Peace was buying groceries without wondering whether part of their money was being used to keep another woman comfortable. Peace was making coffee in the morning and hearing nothing but the soft click of the machine. No lies moving through the hallway. No phone calls taken in the garage. No calm voice telling her she was crazy for noticing what was right in front of her. The blue folder was still there. Maggie kept it in a locked box at the bottom of her closet. Not because she wanted to live inside the betrayal. Not because she needed to read those pages again. She kept it because it reminded her of the night she stopped begging a liar to be honest and started protecting herself. Sometimes people call that cold. Usually. Those are the same people who benefited when you were warm enough to forgive everything. Ethan stayed with her most of the time. He still saw Richard. Maggie never tried to poison that relationship. She knew a son should not have to carry the full weight of his father's failures. But she also stopped pretending for him. She stopped teaching Ethan that love meant swallowing disrespect just to keep a house quiet. She showed him something better. That loyalty without honesty is not love. That sacrifice should never become someone else's secret bank account. That a family is not protected by hiding the truth. It is protected by having the courage to face it. Richard moved into a small apartment across town. There was nothing dramatic about it. No tragedy written across the sky. Just a man living in a place smaller than the life he had tried to keep, while reaching for another one. Vanessa disappeared from his life once the money stopped moving so easily. No final showdown. No beautiful confession in the rain. Just a woman who had wanted stability leaving when stability came with paperwork attached. As for Lily, Maggie never spoke about that child with bitterness. Lily had been pulled into a mess made by adults. She was innocent. Maggie knew better than to turn a child into a symbol of revenge just because the adults around her had behaved badly. That was part of Maggie's healing too. Not hating everyone connected to the wound, just refusing to keep bleeding for them. Maggie went back to work. She walked in the mornings. She met an old friend for lunch once a week. She learned which stores were closest to the townhouse. She bought a smaller couch. She hung family photos slowly, not all at once. Some days, she still stood in the middle of the room and felt the old life tug at her. Of course she did. 27 years does not leave the body just because a judge signs a document. You can win the legal fight and still grieve what you thought was real. You can know you did the right thing and still miss the version of someone who never fully existed. Maggie allowed herself that. But the grief no longer ran the house. The pain no longer had the biggest room. Maggie did not win because she was good at revenge. She won because she stayed steady when pain asked her to become reckless. She kept the records. She waited. She let her attorney speak when her heart wanted to scream. She protected her son, her money, her home, and the part of herself Richard had spent months trying to make her doubt. That was the real victory. Not making Richard suffer. Not watching Vanessa disappear. Not hearing a judge say what Maggie already knew. The real victory was that Maggie did not become unrecognizable just because someone betrayed her. She did not burn her life down to prove she had been hurt. She gathered the truth. She carried it carefully. And when the time came, she let the truth stand where her anger could have stood. In the end, one memo line did not destroy a marriage. It only exposed what Richard had already broken. Those 4 words did not create the betrayal. They revealed it. For our new place. Richard had written the ending without realizing Maggie would be the one to read it first. And once she read it, she did not look away again. If this story reminded you that one small detail can sometimes save a person's whole life, leave your thoughts below. And if you want more stories about betrayal, evidence, divorce, custody battles, and the quiet moments when people take their power back, subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next story.